What if everything you thought you knew about the most famous sibling rivalry in history was merely the surface of something far more profound? Tonight, we venture beyond the sanitized Sunday school version of Jacob and Esau's story into the shadows where ancient prophecy meets modern reality. This isn't just a tale of two brothers fighting over soup and blessings. It's a carefully orchestrated divine blueprint that continues to unfold in ways that will leave you questioning everything. The narrative you're about to witness has been echoing through millennia, shaping nations, bloodlines, and perhaps even your own destiny. Prepare to have your understanding shattered as we uncover the hidden foreshadowing that transforms this ancient drama into a living prophecy. You remember the story, don't you? Twin brothers, born grasping at each other's heels, locked in eternal conflict. One wild and untamed, the other cunning and calculating. But which was which, really? Esau, the firstborn, trading his birthright for a moment's satisfaction, while Jacob, the deceiver, steals not just inheritance but his father's most sacred blessing. Yet beneath this family drama lies something far more sinister and beautiful, a pattern that reveals the very nature of divine selection and human struggle. What if I told you that their story isn't history at all, but prophecy still being written in the headlines of 2025?
Before we start, I need your help. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep bringing these hidden truths to light.
In the ancient world, the birthright wasn't merely about money or property. It was about spiritual authority, the continuation of covenant, the very essence of divine favor. When Esau stumbled home from the hunt, exhausted and famished, he stood at a crossroads that would echo through eternity. The red lentil stew that Jacob prepared wasn't just food. It was a symbol, a test, a moment where temporal desire would clash with eternal significance. But here's what your Sunday school teacher never told you: this wasn't a spontaneous moment of weakness. This was the culmination of a pattern, a character revelation that had been building since the moment they emerged from Rebekah's womb. Esau's casual dismissal of his birthright reveals something profound about the human condition, the tendency to trade eternal value for immediate gratification. What good is a birthright to me if I'm going to die? He reasoned. But death wasn't imminent. Hunger was simply uncomfortable. In that moment, Esau embodied every soul who has ever sacrificed the sacred for the temporary, the eternal for the immediate. Jacob, meanwhile, wasn't just opportunistic. He was driven by an almost supernatural understanding of value, of destiny, of divine selection. The younger brother saw what the older brother couldn't, that some things are worth any price, any weight, any sacrifice. This ancient transaction mirrors modern society's obsession with instant satisfaction over long-term investment. How many birthrights are sold daily in our world? For pleasure, for comfort, for the illusion of immediate success. Esau represents the flesh, the immediate, the visible world that demands satisfaction now, regardless of consequence. Jacob represents the spirit, the unseen realm where true value lies hidden beneath surface appearances. Their conflict isn't just personal, it's cosmic, representing the eternal struggle between two kingdoms, two mindsets, two destinies. But why did God orchestrate this moment? Why allow deception to play such a crucial role in his divine plan? Perhaps because he was establishing a pattern, showing that his ways are not our ways, that his selection often defies human logic and expectation. The birthright battle wasn't about who deserved what. It was about who would carry forward the covenant promise made to Abraham and Isaac. Esau's dismissal wasn't just carelessness. It was a spiritual disqualification, a revelation of heart condition rather than mere circumstance. In trading his birthright, Esau revealed that he never truly understood what he possessed, never grasped the weight of divine calling. And so the pattern was set, the elders serving the younger, the natural order inverted by divine purpose. This wasn't injustice. It was revelation, showing that God's kingdom operates by different rules than earthly kingdom. The birthright battle established a precedent that would ripple through history. Spiritual authority isn't inherited by birth order but by heart condition. Jacob's pursuit of the birthright, though flawed in method, revealed a hunger for divine things that Esau simply didn't possess. In that tent, over that bowl of stew, the future of nations was determined by a choice between the temporal and the eternal. Before their first breath, Before their first heartbeat could be detected, God spoke a prophecy that would shatter conventional understanding. "Two nations are in your womb," he told Rebekah, "and the older will serve the young." A divine reversal that defied every cultural norm. This wasn't merely about two children. It was about two peoples, two destinies, two distinct approaches to the divine covenant. Rebekah felt them struggling with her, wrestling even before birth, as if the conflict of ages was already being fought in her womb. The prophecy wasn't just prediction, it was divine decree, establishing a pattern that would echo through millennia of human history. When they emerged, the symbolism was unmistakable. Esau, red and hairy, representing the earth, the flesh, the immediate and visible. Jacob grasping his brother's heel, already showing the tenacious pursuit that would define his character and destiny. Their names would prove prophetic. Esau, meaning hairy or rough, and Jacob, meaning heel grasper or supplanter. But beneath these surface meanings lay deeper spiritual reality. One representing natural man, the other representing spiritual. The midwife's declaration of Esau as firstborn was correct by human standards, but irrelevant by divine decree. Rebekah carried this prophetic knowledge like a burning secret, watching her sons grow and diverge in character and calling. She observed Isaac's preference for Esau, his delight in wild game and tales of hunt, his identification with the son who seemed most like himself. Yet she remembered God's words, understood that divine selection often contradicts human preference and cultural expectations. This knowledge would eventually drive her to orchestrate one of history's most controversial acts of deception. But was it deception, or was it cooperation with divine destiny, ensuring that God's will would be accomplished despite human blood? The struggle in Rebekah's womb was more than sibling rivalry. It was the eternal conflict between flesh and spirit, temporal and eternal. Esau would grow to embody the natural man, skilled, strong, immediate in his desires and satisfactions. Jacob would embody the spiritual seeker, flawed, struggling, but somehow touched by an otherworldly understanding of value and her mother became the guardian of prophecy, the keeper of divine secrets that would shape the future of nations. In her womb, she carried not just twins but the seeds of Israel and Edom, blessing and judgment, spiritual hunger and earthly satisfaction. This divine selection challenges everything we think we know about fairness, about earned blessing, about natural order. God's choice of Jacob over Esau wasn't based on merit or behavior. It was established before they could do good. The prophecy reveals a sovereign God who sees the end from the beginning, who chooses according to his purposes rather than human expectations. Rebekah's pregnancy becomes a metaphor for divine election. Mysterious, sometimes troubling, but ultimately full. The twins in her womb represent two ways of approaching life, two responses to divine calling, two eternal. Isaac's failing eyesight becomes a powerful metaphor for spiritual blindness that affects even the most blessed patriarchs. Here was a man who had experienced divine intervention, who had been laid on an altar and spared by God's direct intervention. Yet as he aged, his spiritual perception seemed to diminish along with his physical sight, favoring the dead. His flesh over the son chosen by divine decree. His blindness wasn't just physical, it was a failure to discern spiritual reality, to recognize God's selection in the most crucial moment of it. The irony is profound. The man who had been saved by divine provision couldn't see divine purpose in his household. Isaac's preference for Esau reveals how even the faithful can be deceived by external appearances and personages. Esau's hunting skills, his masculine presence, his ability to provide silvery meat, these earthly qualities impressed the patriarch. Meanwhile, Jacob's spiritual hunger, his pursuit of birthright, his understanding of covenant significance, these went unnoticed or appreciated. Isaac's blindness represents the tendency of flesh to prefer flesh, of natural man to gravitate toward His failure to remember or apply God's prophetic word about his sons shows how easily we can drift from divine revelation to. The scene of Isaac preparing to bless Esau becomes a moment of tension, divine will versus human will. Isaac, believing he was giving his patriarchal blessing to his chosen heir, was actually opposing the divine decree spoken before their birth. His request for savory meat before the blessing reveals an earthly mindset: blessing based on service rendered, favor earned through vision. But God's blessings don't operate on the economed merit. They flow according to divine purpose and selection. Isaac's spiritual blindness was about to be corrected through the most controversial intervention in biblical history. What Isaac couldn't see, Rebekah perceived with clarity. God's will was being threatened by difference. Her decision to orchestrate Jacob's deception wasn't maternal favoritism. It was prophetic intervention, ensuring divine purpose over blindness. She understood that Isaac's blessing, once spoken, could be retracted. The patriarchal pronouncement carried supernatural authority. The urgency of the moment demanded action that would appear deceptive, but was actually corrective, aligning human action with decree. Rebekah's intervention reveals the tension between respecting human authority and ensuring divine will. Isaac's blindness forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about spiritual perception and imitation. Even the most blessed can become spiritually myopic, preferring the familiar over the divinely appointed, the natural over the supernatural. His physical blindness became a symbol of spiritual blindness that affects anyone who loses sight of God's will. The tragedy isn't that Isaac was deceived, but that he had already been self-deceived, choosing natural preference over divine prophecy. His blindness, both literal and spiritual, set the stage for one of the most controversial acts of divine intervention in history. The moment of deception arrives like a storm on a clear day, sudden, shocking, yet somehow inevitable, given the spiritual forces at play. Rebekah's hands tremble not with guilt, but with the weight of divine purpose as she wraps goatskins around Jacob's smooth arms. This isn't merely a mother's favoritism. It's a woman cooperating with prophecy, ensuring that God's declared will overcomes human blindness. The irony cuts deep. Truth must wear the mask of deception because the keeper of blessing has lost sight of divine decree. Jacob's hesitation reveals his understanding of the magnitude. This moment will either fulfill destiny or destroy his family forever. As Jacob approaches his father's tent wearing Esau's identity, the cosmic tension reaches its breaking point. Isaac's questioning, "Are you really my son Esau?" echoes through eternity as the moment when divine will and human perception collide. The touch test, the smell test, the voice that doesn't quite match. Each element builds toward a blessing that will reshape history. Jacob's answer, "I am," becomes both deception and profound truth. He is indeed the son chosen to carry forward the covenant. The blessing flows not because of deception but despite it, revealing that God's purposes transcend human methods and moral complexities. Isaac's pronouncement transforms Jacob from supplanter to inheritor. "May God give you heavens, dew and earth's richness." The words carry supernatural weight, activating promises made to Abraham, establishing Jacob as the covenant bearer for generations. But hidden within the blessing is a darker element, the confirmation that nations will bow to him, that his own brother will serve him. The blessing cannot be retracted once spoken. It becomes spiritual law, divine decree clothed in patriarchal authority. Isaac's blindness becomes the means by which God's sight prevails, human limitation becoming divine opportunity. When Esau arrives with his prepared meal, the full magnitude of what has transpired begins to unfold. His cry, "Bless me, even me, also, O my father," pierces the heavens with the anguish of one who has lost everything. Isaac's trembling as he realizes what has happened isn't fear of deception, but recognition of divine intervention beyond his control. The blessing given to Jacob cannot be undone, cannot be shared, cannot be transferred. It belongs to the chosen, son forever. Esau's tears and Isaac's secondary blessing reveal the irrevocable nature of divine selection and patriarchal pronouncement. This moment of deception becomes the hinge of history, the point where divine election overrules human preference. Jacob emerges not as a thief, but as the recipient of what was always intended to be his by divine decree. The controversy of the method doesn't negate the righteousness of the outcome, God's will accomplished through human complexity. Esau's rage Isaac's shock, Rebekah's vindication, all swirl together in a moment that will echo through millennia. The deception reveals a profound truth. Sometimes divine purposes must overcome human blindness through the most unexpected means. The moment Esau comprehends the full scope of his loss, something dies in his soul and something else is born, a hatred that will outlive both brothers. His tears are not of repentance but of rage, not of spiritual awakening but of wounded pride and shattered earthly dream. "He has supplanted me these 2 times, Esau cried, finally understanding the prophetic significance of Jacob's name. But his fury reveals a deeper spiritual blindness. He mourns the loss of blessing while remaining indifferent to the responsibility it carried. In this moment, Esau transforms from the merely careless into the actively hostile, from spiritually indifferent to spiritually opposed. Isaac's secondary blessing for Esau carries ominous prophetic, "By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother." Yet embedded within this seeming curse lies a promise. "When you become restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck." These words establish not just personal destiny but national prophecy. Edom's relationship with Israel defined for millennia. Esau's blessing isn't spiritual but material, not covenant-based but conflict-centered, not about service to God but mastery over circumstances. The contrast between the brothers' blessings reveals 2 different approaches to exist, one seeking divine approval, the other asserting human dominance. Esau's decision to murder Jacob after Isaac's death reveals the ultimate destination of spiritual carelessness, active opposition to God's chosen. His hatred isn't just personal vendetta, it's spiritual warfare, the flesh rising up against the spirit, the natural man opposing divine. The plot to kill Jacob represents more than sibling rivalry. It's an attempt to thwart divine purpose, to undo prophetic decree through violence. Rebekah's discovery of Esau's murderous intent forces another intervention, another moment where human action must align with divine protection. The threat to Jacob's life becomes a threat to the covenant itself, to the promises made to Abraham and Isaac about their descendants. Rebekah's urgent warning to Jacob, "Arise, flee to my brother Laban," launches the next phase of divine orchestration. Jacob's exile isn't punishment for deception, but protection for the covenant bearer, ensuring his survival to fulfill his destiny. Esau's rage has become a tool in God's hands, driving Jacob toward the experiences that will transform him from supplanter to... The separation of the brothers isn't just family decision, it's divine strategy, allowing both to mature along their chosen. Rebekah's final intervention saves not just Jacob's life, but the future of the covenant promises made to his forefathers. As Jacob flees toward Haran, Esau's fury echoes behind him like thunder, establishing a pattern of conflict that will define nations. The hatred born in that moment will manifest in Edom's consistent opposition to Israel throughout biblical. Esau's descendants will carry his spiritual DNA, the tendency to oppose divine election, to resent covenant privilege, to choose immediate satisfaction over eternal significance. The brothers' separation marks the birth of 2 peoples with fundamentally different relationships to the divine covenant. Jacob carries the blessing into exile, while Esau remains land, blessed materially but spiritually estranged from divine. Jacob's flight from Beersheba toward Haran begins as escape but becomes pilgrimage, each step carrying him deeper into divine. The young man who secured blessing through deception now faces the wilderness alone, carrying only a staff and the weight of prophecy. His journey isn't just geographical, but spiritual, from the security of family tents to the certainty of foreign lands, from dependence to independence. Every mile traveled takes him further from the scene of controversy and closer to the experiences that will forge his character. The exile that began as necessity will become education. The flight that started in fear will end in trance. As darkness falls on his first night of exile, Jacob chooses a seemingly random rest. Yet nothing in his story is truly random. The stone he selects as a pillow becomes an altar. The ground he considers ordinary becomes holy. The sleep he seeks becomes divine encounter. Bethel awaits him, though he doesn't know it yet. The house of God disguised as desolate wilderness. heaven's gate hidden in apparentment. His physical exhaustion creates spiritual opportunity. His vulnerable state opens a divine revelation in ways comfort never could. The night that seems like ending becomes beginning, the moment of greatest loneliness becoming the launching point for divine relationship. In sleep, Jacob encounters the ladder that bridges heaven and earth. With angels ascending and descending in endless procession, the vision reveals that his exile isn't abandonment, but divine accompaniment. His journey isn't solitary, but supervive. God's voice breaks the silence of his first night home. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham. The covenant promises, land, descendants, blessing all nations, are transferred to the fugitive, establishing continuity despite controversy. Jacob's isolation becomes the setting for the most profound divine encounter of his life, exile transformed into God's promise to Jacob carries special poignancy given his circumstances. Behold, I am with you, and will keep you go. The assurance isn't conditional on his righteousness or dependent on his remaining in the promised land. It's covenant faithfulness, despite complexity. The divine commitment to bring him back to the land establishes hope in the midst of uncertainty, purpose within apparent purposelessness. Jacob's flight becomes the beginning of a 20-year journey that will test, refine, and ultimately transform his character. The blessing obtained through deception must now be validated through experience, proven through trial, mature time. Jacob's awakening brings the revelation that transforms understanding. Surely the Lord's in this place, and I did not know it. His fear isn't fear, but awe. The recognition that he has encountered the divine in the most unlikely circumstances. The stone pillow becomes a pillar, the desolate place becomes Bethel, house of God, and the fugitive worshiper. His vow to return a tenth of all his possessions reveals the beginning of spiritual maturity, the first fruits of transitive encounter. The deceiver's flight has become the covenant-error's commissioning, exile transformed into divine appointment. 20 years of exile begin with Jacob's arrival in Haran, where divine providence orchestrates another seemingly chance encounter at a well. Rachel's beauty captivates him instantly, but beneath the surface attraction lies a deeper spiritual reality. She represents the completion of his destiny. Laban's warm welcome masks the calculating mind of a man who recognizes opportunity when it presents itself at his doorstep. The uncle who should provide refuge becomes the instrument of Jacob's refinement. The relative who should offer comfort becomes the source of testing. Divine irony unfolds as the master deceiver encounters one whose cunning will exceed even his own practiced manipulation. Jacob's offer to work 7 years for Rachel reveals the depth of his transformation. The impatient youth who once demanded immediate satisfaction now commits to patient labor. Those 7 years seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her, marking a profound shift from selfish ambition to sacrificial devotion. Yet Laban's wedding night substitution of Leah for Rachel delivers a stunning blow. The deceiver becomes the deceived in the most intimate possible way. The morning revelation that he has married the wrong woman must have echoed with ironic justice, Jacob tasting the bitter fruit of deception from the receiving end. Laban's excuse about local custom cannot mask the calculated nature of his betrayal, the systematic exploitation of Jacob's vulnerability and desire. The demand for another 7 years of labor reveals Laban's true character, a man who views relationship as commodity, who monetizes love and leverages desperation. Jacob's agreement to serve demonstrates his spiritual growth. The old Jacob might have fled or sought revenge, but the maturing patriarch accepts divine discipline. The complex marriage arrangement with both sisters creates a household fraught with tension, competition, and the seeds of future tribal division. Leah's unloved status and Rachel's barrenness establish competing narratives of blessing and curse within Jacob's own home. Divine sovereignty works through human complexity, using even deception and marital discord to accomplish his generational purposes. The birth of sons to both wives and their servants creates the foundation of Israel's 12 tribes, born from conflict but destined for covenant blessing. Each name given reveals the spiritual struggles of the mothers, Leah's desperate attempts to win love, Rachel's anguish over barrenness, the servants' roles in tribal competition. Jacob finds himself in the middle of a domestic battlefield, where his wives compete for his affection through childbearing and naming strategy. The household dynamics mirror larger spiritual realities: the struggle between flesh and spirit, the tension between human desire and divine timing. Through 20 years of relational complexity, Jacob learns patience, endurance, and the cost of commitment in ways his earlier deceptions never taught him. Laban's changing attitude toward Jacob reveals the classic pattern of exploitation: warm welcome followed by systematic abuse as dependence increases. The uncle who once embraced him as family begins to view him as threat, recognizing that God's blessing on Jacob exceeds his own prosperity. Jacob's growing wealth and influence create tension that cannot be resolved through negotiation or compromise. Separation becomes inevitable. The divine command to return to the promised land comes at precisely the right moment, when staying would mean continued oppression, but leaving requires courage. 20 years of exile have transformed the deceiver into a patriarch, the fugitive into a man ready to face his past and claim his destiny. The journey toward reconciliation with Esau becomes a journey toward reconciliation with God, each step bringing Jacob closer to the confrontation that will define his identity. As messengers return with news that Esau approaches with 400 men, terror grips Jacob's. The past cannot be escaped, only fit. His elaborate gifts, his strategic division of his camp, his desperate prayers, all reveal a man grappling with the consequences of choices made decades earlier. The night at Jabbok becomes the setting for the most mysterious encounter in Jacob's life, where human wrestling becomes divine transformation. Alone by the river, separated from family and possessions, Jacob faces the ultimate test, not of his cunning, but of his willingness to surrender. The mysterious wrestler who engages Jacob in combat throughout the night represents more than human opponent. This is divine encounter disguised as mortal soul. Each hold attempted, each throw executed, each moment of apparent advantage reveals the futility of human strength against divine purpose. As dawn approaches and the wrestler touches Jacob's hip socket, physical disability becomes spiritual innate. Weakness becomes the source of blessing. The demand for Jacob's name forces him to confess his identity as Subter, acknowledging the character that has defined his relationships and choices. The wrestling match becomes confession booth, therapeutic session, and transformation chamber all simultaneously. Divine surgery performed in darkness. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. The name change represents more than linguistic shift. It marks the birth of a new identity rooted in divine encounter, rather than human deception. Israel means he who wrestles with God, or God fights, establishing a precedent for legitimate spiritual struggle within covenant relationship. The blessing Jacob seeks isn't material prosperity, but divine approval, the validation that his pursuit of covenant privilege was divinely ordained despite flawed methodology. His refusal to release the wrestler until receiving blessing reveals the spiritual hunger that always lay beneath his manipulative. The question, "What is your name?" echoes throughout the night, forcing Jacob to confront not just his identity but his history, his character, his deepest motivations. When he asks the wrestler's name in return, the refusal to answer maintains the mystery while establishing the divine nature of the encounter. The blessing given at Jabbok isn't earned through wrestling prowess, but granted through persistent pursuit of divine favor despite personal lust. Jacob's limping departure marks him physically but transforms him spiritually. The wound becomes the sign of authentic encounter with Peniel, faced God, becomes his name for the place where he saw God face to face, and yet my life was served. The transformation from Jacob to Israel represents the culmination 20 years of divine discipline, preparation, and character development. The deceiver has become the wrestler. The manipulator has become the patriarch. The fugitive has become the father. His limp will remind him forever that true strength comes through acknowledgement, that divine blessing flows through surrender rather than striving. The wrestling match establishes a pattern for all who would follow: legitimate spiritual struggle, persistent pursuit of blessing, transformation through divine encounter. As dawn breaks over Jabbok, Jacob emerges Israel, ready to face Esau not as deceiver seeking to avoid consequences, but as covenant-bearer prepared to embrace recognition. The morning sun illuminates a transformed Jacob as approaches the moment of reckoning. Esau, his household arranged in careful order behind him. 400 men accompany his brother, an army that could represent either welcome escort or execution squad, depending on Esau's 20-year cultivate. Jacob's sevenfold bowing reveals the depth of his transformation. Proud, deceiver now humbles himself completely before the brother wronged. The gifts sent ahead, the strategic positioning of family members, the careful choreography of approach, all demonstrate both wisdom and gesture. Yet beneath the calculated preparation lies something new, authentic humility born from divine encounter, rather than mere tactic. Esau's response shatters every expectation, every calculation, every fear that has torn Jacob. Throughout his journey, instead of vengeance there is embrace, instead of condemnation there is weeping, instead of demand for restitution there is overwhelming grace. The brother who swore to kill Jacob 20 years earlier now runs to meet him, falls on his neck and kisses him in complete forgiveness. This moment of reconciliation becomes a picture of divine grace, unearned, unexpected, transformative in its generous scope and imitation. The tears that flow between the brothers wash away 2 decades of separation, resentment, and the bitter aftermath deception. Jacob's insistence that Esau accept his gifts reveals his understanding that reconciliation requires acknowledgement of wrong and attempt. Please accept my blessing as brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and be enough. The words of a man transformed by encounter. The term blessing used for his gifts carries profound irony. Jacob offers back to Esau a portion of what was taken through deception decades earlier. Esau's initial refusal and eventual acceptance demonstrate the grace required for true forgiveness, receiving restitution without demanding it, accepting gifts, sharing them. The exchange of gifts be sacramental, physical symbol of spiritual reconciliation that transcends human logic and expectation. Jacob's statement that seeing Esau's face is like seeing the face of God reveals the depth of his transformation and the profundity of grace received. Having wrestled with God at Jabbok, he now recognizes divine grace reflected in human forgiveness. Seeing God's character mirrored in his brother's mercy, the parallel between divine acceptance and fraternal reconciliation establishes a pattern. God's forgiveness enables and models human forgiveness. Esau's offer to journey together is declined by Jacob, not from fear but from wisdom. Their paths must remain separate even in reconciliation. The parting is peaceful, complete, free from the bitterness that has poisoned their relationship for 2 decades. This reconciliation scene becomes one of the most powerful pictures of grace in ancient literature, demonstrating forgiveness's power to transform both giver and receiver. Esau's choice to forgive reveals character development during their separation. The angry young man has become a gracious leader capable of extraordinary mercy. Jacob's humility and genuine repentance create the conditions for reconciliation, showing that true restoration requires acknowledgement of wrong alongside plea for forgiveness. The meeting that could have ended in bloodshed becomes a celebration of restored relationship, divine grace made manifest through human choice. Their embrace at the Jordan represents more than personal reconciliation. It foreshadows the ultimate reconciliation between all who have been estranged through human failure and divine grace. The story of Jacob and Esau transcends personal narrative to become the template for understanding divine election and its consequences throughout history. Rebekah's prophetic word, "2 nations are in your womb," establishes a pattern that will repeat across millennia, wherever divine purpose intersects with human choice. Israel and Edom emerge not just as neighboring peoples but as representatives of 2 fundamentally different approaches to divine covenant and spiritual reality. The elder serving the younger becomes a recurring theme in God's dealings with humanity, consistently overturning natural expectations and cultural norms. Their story provides the interpretive key for understanding why divine selection often appears to contradict human logic and conventional wisdom. Throughout biblical history, the descendants of Jacob and Esau maintain their ancestral characteristics, and conflicts with stunning consistency. Edom's persistent opposition to Israel during the wilderness wandering, their refusal of passage, their delight in Israel's troubles, all echo Esau's original resentment. The Edomites' collaboration, Babylon during Jerusalem's destruction, fulfills the ancient pattern of the elder, opposing the younger's divine calling. Obadiah's prophecy against Edom reveals the ultimate consequences of persistent opposition to divine election and covenant purpose. The destruction of Edom and the survival of Israel demonstrate the long-term vindication of divine choice, despite temporary appearances of Edom's advantage. The pattern extends beyond biological descendants to encompass spiritual principles that govern divine selection throughout salvation history. Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, Saul and David, the Pharisees, and the disciples. The elder-younger dynamic repeats with prophetic consistency. Natural birth order, cultural expectation, and human merit consistently give way to divine purpose and spiritual receptivity. The pattern reveals God's tendency to choose the unlikely, the younger, the despised, the overlooked by human standards. Each repetition reinforces the principle that divine kingdom operates by different rules than earthly kingdoms, spiritual logic rather than natural progression. Paul's interpretation in Romans 9 establishes the theological framework for understanding Jacob and Esau's significance in divine election. Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated becomes not arbitrary divine preference, but the revelation of sovereignty that transcends human comprehension. The apostles' argument that divine choice precedes human action demonstrates that election is rooted in divine purpose rather than foreseen merit. The potter-clay metaphor illustrates divine prerogative to shape vessels according to purpose rather than material preference or natural expectation. The scandal of election, that God chooses according to his will rather than human words, finds its ultimate expression in the Jacob-Esau narrative. Contemporary applications of this ancient pattern continue to unfold in ways that validate its prophetic significance for modern understanding. The tension between natural expectation and divine selection manifests in every generation where spiritual calling contradicts social convention. Religious institutions often embody Esau's characteristics: established, confident, naturally advantaged, while spiritual awakening comes through unlikely sources. The pattern challenges every assumption about divine favor, forcing recognition that God's ways transcend human categories and cultural expectations. Jacob and Esau's story provides the lens through which we must view all divine activity, all spiritual conflict, all questions of calling and election. Walk into any boardroom, any family gathering, any place where human ambition intersects with limited resources, and you'll witness Jacob and Esau's conflict playing out in real time. The birthright mentality persists in modern form. Those who possess advantage, position, or inheritance often treat it as casually as Esau treated his spiritual. Meanwhile, the Jacob spirit manifests in those willing to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term vision, trading temporary satisfaction for permanent significance. Corporate dynasties fall when heirs embody Esau's carelessness, while empires rise through leaders who possess Jacob's relentless pursuit of ultimate. The ancient struggle between temporal gratification and eternal investment continues to determine the fate of individuals, families, and modern politics reflects the Jacob-Esau dynamic with startling clarity as established power face challenges from unexpected sources that seem to violate natural order. The younger candidate defeating the experienced politician, the outsider overturning institutional advantage, the unlikely coalition displacing the favored establishment, all echo ancient patterns. Esau's confidence in natural advantage mirrors every political machine's assumption that organization, funding, and traditional support guarantee victory. Jacob's patient maneuvering reflects the persistent pursuit of those who understand that true power lies not in appearances but in understanding deeper currents. Election cycles become wrestling matches where the outcome often defies conventional wisdom, revealing that divine principles still govern humans. In family systems, the Jacob-Esau pattern manifests in sibling dynamics that transcend birth order, creating conflicts that echo through generations. The responsible child who inherits family business but lacks spiritual vision often finds themselves displaced by the problematic sibling who possesses deeper understanding value. Inheritance battles reveal character in ways that peaceful ties cannot, forcing family members to choose between immediate gain and long-term relationship. The child who seemed least likely to succeed often emerges as the one who truly understands family legacy, while the obvious heir proves spiritually bankrupt. These modern domestic dramas replay ancient themes, demonstrating that the fundamental human conflicts transcend cultural and temps. Religious institutions frequently embody the Esau mentality, confident in traditional advantage, dismissive of spiritual hunger that doesn't conform to established patterns. The firstborn denominations, secure in historical precedents and institutional power, often miss movements of genuine spiritual awakening that emerge from unexplored sources. Meanwhile, the Jacob movements arise from margins, characterized by hunger for authentic encounter rather than satisfaction with inherent position. The pattern repeats: established religion feeling threatened by spiritual movements it cannot control, just as Esau felt threatened by Jacob's spiritual appetite. Contemporary church history validates the ancient pattern. God's work often emerges not from centers of power, but from peripheries of persistent hunger. Global economics reflects Jacob and Esau principles in the rise and fall of nations. The transfer of wealth and influence that defies natural expectation. Established powers that take their dominance for granted often find themselves displaced by hungrier nations that pursue long-term vision over comfort. The birthright of economic advantage can be traded away through short policies, just as Esau traded eternal inheritance for temporary satisfaction. Emerging economies that embrace the Jacob principle, patient investment, long-term thinking, willingness to sacrifice immediate pleasure, future advantage, often surpass ours. The ancient pattern reveals that economic and political dominance isn't permanent, but flows to those who understand the value of what others take for granted. The conflict between Jacob and Esau represents the eternal war between two kingdoms that exists within every human heart, every generation, every spiritual decision. Esau embodies the flesh, immediate, visible, concerned with physical satisfaction and temporal advantage, dismissive of unseen spiritual realities. Jacob represents the spirit, persistent in pursuing invisible values, willing to sacrifice present comfort for future blessing, understanding that true inheritance transcends material possession. This internal conflict explains why their story resonates so powerfully across cultures and centuries. It's not just historical narrative, but spiritual autobiography. Every believer faces Jacob-Esau, moments where temporal desire wars against eternal vision, where immediate gratification competes with spiritual investment. The birthright transaction becomes a paradigm for every spiritual choice. Moments where eternal values must be weighed against temporary pressures and immediate needs. How many have sold their spiritual birthright for the modern equivalent of red stew, career advancement that requires moral compromise, relationships that diminish spiritual vitality? The Esau spirit whispers that survival trumps significance, that practical concerns outweigh spiritual considerations, that what good is a birthright if you're going to die? The Jacob spirit recognizes that some things are worth any sacrifice, that spiritual inheritance carries value that transcends immediate circumstances or temporary discomfort. These daily choices accumulate into character, into destiny, into the ultimate revelation of which kingdom truly holds our allegiance and shapes our decisions. The deception narrative reveals how divine purposes often work through human complexity, moral ambiguity, and situations that resist simple ethical categorization. Rebecca's intervention challenges comfortable assumptions about how God accomplishes his will, sometimes through means that appear questionable but serve ultimate righteousness. The tension between honoring human authority, Isaac's preferences, and ensuring divine will, God's prophetic decree, creates moral complexity that mirrors contemporary spiritual dilemmas. Modern believers face similar conflicts where divine calling seems to require actions that challenge established authority, cultural expectation, or conventional morality. The Jacob-Rebecca conspiracy demonstrates that spiritual warfare sometimes requires strategies that appear deceptive, but serve to overcome spiritual blindness and natural resistance to divine purpose. Esau's rage and plot to murder Jacob reveal the ultimate destination of spiritual carelessness, active opposition to divine purpose in those who pursue it. The progression from indifference to hostility mirrors the spiritual journey of many who begin neutral toward divine things, but end actively opposed to spiritual awakening. His 20-year cultivation of hatred demonstrates how spiritual rejection metastasizes into persistent opposition that transcends rational explanation or personal reconciliation attempt. Contemporary spiritual warfare often follows this pattern. Those who casually dismiss spiritual values eventually become actively hostile to spiritual movements and spiritually minded people. The Esau spirit in modern form manifests as sophisticated opposition to spiritual awakening, using cultural respectability and rational arguments to mask spiritual hostility. The wrestling at Jabbok establishes the template for authentic spiritual encounter, struggle that leads to transformation, resistance that births surrender, weakness that becomes strength. Jacob's refusal to release the divine wrestler until receiving blessing demonstrates the spiritual hunger that ultimately prevails over natural strength and human methodology. The hip displacement reveals that authentic divine encounter leaves permanent marks, transformation that affects how we walk, how we rate, how we understand ourselves in relation to divine purpose. Modern spiritual wrestling follows similar patterns. Seasons of struggle where human effort proves inadequate, forcing surrender that leads to spiritual breakthrough and identity transformation. The progression from Jacob, supplanter, to Israel, one who wrestles with God, charts the journey from manipulation to authenticity, from human striving to divine empowerment. The reconciliation with Esau demonstrates grace's power to transcend spiritual warfare, showing that even the most entrenched opposition can be overcome through divine transformation. Esau's embrace reveals that grace can soften the hardest hearts, that forgiveness can heal the deepest wounds, that divine love can triumph over generational conflict. Jacob's humility in approaching Esau shows how authentic spiritual maturity creates conditions for reconciliation, even with those who have legitimate grievances against. The peaceful parting demonstrates that spiritual reconciliation doesn't require ongoing relationship, but can achieve closure that honors both divine grace and practical wisdom. Their story provides hope that even the most bitter spiritual conflicts can find resolution through grace, transformation, and the recognition that divine love transcends human. The Jacob-Esau narrative establishes a prophetic template that extends from the beginning of biblical history to its ultimate consummation in divine judgment and restoration. Their story provides the interpretive framework for understanding how divine election works throughout salvation history, from individual calling to national destiny to cosmic redemption. The pattern of younger displacing elder, spiritual overcoming, natural, chosen, defeating, expected, all find their ultimate fulfillment in Christ's victory over religious establishment and natural exit. Jesus embodies the Jacob principle in his birth circumstances, his rejection by religious authorities, his victory through apparent defeat, his elevation of the humble over proud. The entire biblical narrative can be read through the lens of Jacob-Esau conflict, revealing consistent divine methodology that culminates in final vindication of divine. Prophetic literature consistently employs Esau and Edom as symbols of opposition to divine purpose, representing all who resist God's sovereign election and covenant blessing. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Obadiah use Edom's fate as paradigm for all nations that oppose Israel, and by extension, God's redemptive plan. The Day of the Lord passages often focus on Edom's judgment, not merely as historical prediction but as spiritual principle. Persistent opposition to divine purpose faces ultimate consequence. Malachi's "Jacob I loved but Esau I hated" becomes prophetic declaration of divine sovereignty that transcends human understanding and cultural expectation. The prophetic timeline reveals Jacob-Esau conflict as cosmic struggle between kingdoms of light and darkness, covenant blessing and natural rebellion. Revelation's imagery of two beasts, two cities, two women, two harvests, all echo the fundamental duality established in Rebekah's womb, with two nations. The beast from the earth represents Esau's earthly, natural, immediately satisfying approach to power and worship, appealing to flesh through sign wonders. The woman clothed with the sun embodies Jacob's pursuit of divine approval, spiritual authority, and covenant blessing despite earthly persecution and apparent advantage. Babylon and New Jerusalem represent the ultimate expression of Esau and Jacob principles, one seeking immediate dominance through earthly power, the other awaiting divine vindication through patient endurance. The final conflict between these cities reveals Jacob-Esau's struggle in its ultimate cosmic dimensions, where divine election faces final opposition before eternal solution. The millennium and final judgment scenes complete the Jacob-Esau pattern, with ultimate vindication of divine choice and final punishment of persistent opposition to covenant purpose. Satan's release and final rebellion demonstrate the Esau principle in its form, natural hatred of divine authority that persists even after experiencing divine mercy. The great white throne judgment separates eternally between those who embrace divine election, Jacob's descent spiritually, and those who reject it, Esau's offspring. The new heaven and new earth represent the final triumph of Jacob's vision over Esau's temporality, spiritual reality over natural limitation, divine purpose. The prophetic timeline validates Rebekah's prophecy. The elder ultimately serves the younger. Natural gives way to spiritual. Temporal surrenders. Contemporary events increasingly reflect biblical end times patterns, suggesting that Jacob-Esau conflict approaches its final prophetic resolution. In our generation, the restoration of Israel as a nation, the persistent Middle Eastern conflicts, the global division between spiritual awakening and secular opposition, all echo ancient themes with urgency. Nations align themselves according to Esau or Jacob principles, some embracing immediate satisfaction, natural advantage, others pursuing long-term vision and spiritual values despite present disadvantage. The acceleration of these patterns in recent decades suggests that ancient prophecies are convergent fulfillment, that Jacob-Esau conflict approaches its predetermined conclusion. Modern believers find themselves living within prophetic timeline where their story participates in cosmic resolution of conflicts that began in Rebekah's womb and will end in divine throne room. Every human heart becomes a battleground where Jacob and Esau wage war for dominance, where spiritual hunger competes with fleshly satisfaction, where eternal vision struggles against temporal immediacy. The question isn't whether you possess both natures. Scripture confirms that flesh and spirit war within every believer, but which nature you feed, which voice you follow, which values ultimately govern your choices. Esau moments come disguised as practical necessities, reasonable compromises, and urgent needs that seem to justify trading eternal inheritance for temporary relief or immediate gratification. Jacob moments demand sacrifice of present comfort for future blessing, choosing spiritual investment over material security, pursuing divine approval despite human disapproval. Your daily choices reveal which brother's spiritual DNA dominates your decision-making, which kingdom claims your ultimate allegiance, which inheritance you truly value. The birthright transaction repeats in countless modern forms: career decisions that require moral compromise, relationship choices that diminish spiritual vitality, financial priorities that reveal heart allegiance. How often have you stood in Esau's sandals, exhausted from life's demands, tempted to trade spiritual privilege for immediate relief, reasoning that survival trumps spiritual significance? The Jacob spirit recognizes that some prices are too high to pay, some compromises too costly to make, some inheritance is too valuable to trade regardless of present pressure or discomfort. Modern discipleship requires Jacob-like understanding of spiritual value, willingness to sacrifice immediate satisfaction for long-term spiritual investment, patience to wait for divine timing rather than forcing human solutions. The daily choice between Esau's pragmatism and Jacob's vision determines not just present circumstances but eternal destiny, not just temporal success, but spiritual inheritance. Rebekah's intervention challenges comfortable assumptions about how divine purposes work through human complexity, moral ambiguity, and situations that resist simple ethical categorization. Sometimes spiritual breakthrough requires strategic action that appears deceptive, but serves to overcome spiritual blindness and natural resistance to divine purpose. Contemporary believers face similar dilemmas where divine calling seems to require choices that challenge established authority, cultural expectation, or conventional wisdom. The tension between honoring human leadership and ensuring divine will creates complexity that demands spiritual discernment, prophetic insight, and courage to act on divine revelation. Your willingness to participate in divine purpose despite moral complexity reveals whether you possess Rebekah's prophetic vision or Isaac's spiritual blindness. Jacob's wrestling at Jabbok provides the template for authentic spiritual breakthrough, struggle that leads to transformation, resistance that births surrender, human weakness that becomes divine strength. Every believer faces Jabbok moments where human effort proves inadequate, where natural abilities reach their limit, where spiritual advancement requires supernatural intervention. The divine wrestler appears in various forms: difficult circumstances, challenging relationships, impossible situations that force dependence on divine grace rather than human capability. Your response to these wrestling seasons determines whether you emerge as Israel, one who has wrestled with God and prevailed through surrender, or remain Jacob, the supplanter trying to manipulate divine blessing through human strategy. The hip displacement that permanently altered Jacob's walk represents the lasting transformation that authentic divine encounter produced. You cannot wrestle with God and remain unchanged. The reconciliation with Esau demonstrates grace's power to heal the deepest wounds, resolve the bitterest conflicts, and restore relationships that seemed permanently destroyed by past failures. Your willingness to humble yourself before those you've wronged, to offer genuine restitution rather than mere apology, to approach reconciliation with Jacob's authentic repentance rather than Esau's surface emotion. This reveals spiritual maturity, the grace to forgive those who have wronged you, to embrace rather than execute vengeance, to see God's face in human forgiveness. This demonstrates Esau's surprising capacity for grace despite justified grief. Some reconciliations require ongoing relationship while others need only peaceful closure. But all require recognition that divine love transcends human failure and enables supernatural forgiveness. Your response to opportunities for reconciliation reveals whether you've learned Jacob's lesson about grace received and Esau's lesson about grace extended, whether you can both give and receive the forgiveness that heals generational. We reach the end of this ancient narrative. The silence that follows should be filled with recognition. This story isn't history but prophecy, not completed event but ongoing revelation. The struggle that began in Rebekah's womb continues in every human heart, every family system, every generation that must choose between temporal satisfaction and eternal significance. Jacob and Esau's conflict echoes through time because it represents the fundamental choice that defines human existence. Will you live for the seen or the unseen, the immediate or the eternal, the natural or the... Their story provides not just historical instruction, but prophetic warning. Not merely ancient drama, but contemporary mirror reflecting the choices that determine individual and national need. The foreshadowing embedded in their narrative continues to unfold in ways that validate divine sovereignty, prophetic accuracy, and the timeless relevance of spiritual principles over natural expectations. Every sunrise presents new opportunities to choose between Esau's casual dismissal of spiritual privilege and Jacob's persistent pursuit of divine blessing despite personal. The birthright moments come disguised as ordinary decisions. How you treat spiritual inheritance, whether you value eternal or temporal, if you're willing to sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term spiritual. Your response to these moments reveals which brother's nature dominates your character, which kingdom claims your ultimate allegiance, which inheritance you consider most valuable. The accumulation of these choices creates spiritual momentum that either draws you toward divine purpose, Jacob, or away from spiritual significance. The ancient pattern continues because human nature remains unchanged. Each generation faces the same fundamental choice between flesh and spirit, time and eternity. natural and supernatural. The wrestling at Jabbok awaits every serious spirit seeker, the place where human effort meets divine resistance, where natural strength encounters supernatural opposition, where surrender becomes victory. Your willingness to engage in this struggle, to persist until receiving blessing, to allow divine encounter to permanently alter your spiritual walk. This determines whether you remain a supplanter or become one who wrestles with God and prevails. The transformation from Jacob to Israel represents the goal of spiritual maturity, moving from manipulation to authenticity, from human strategy to divine empowerment, from self-effort to God. Contemporary believers who embrace this wrestling emerge with new identity, authority, and permanent reminder that true strength comes through acknowledged weakness rather than natural ability. The limp that marked Jacob's transformation becomes the sign of authentic spiritual encounter. You cannot meet God and remain unchanged, cannot wrestle with divine purpose and walk affected. The reconciliation scene provides hope that even the most bitter spiritual conflicts can find resolution through grace, humility, and recognition that divine love transcends human failure. Your broken relationships, family conflicts, spiritual disputes that seem permanently damaged, all can experience healing when approached with Jacob's humility and met with Esau's grace. The embrace that seemed impossible after 20 years of separation demonstrates that time, distance, and accumulated hurt cannot ultimately defeat the power of authentic forgiveness. Contemporary applications of this principle offer hope for healing racial divisions, denominational conflicts, family feuds, and personal relationships damaged by past betrayal. The pattern established at their reunion continues to provide template for reconciliation that honors both justice and mercy, accountability and grace, truth and love. As the ancient echo of their story reverberates into eternity, the question that began in Rebekah's womb finds its answer in your daily choices, your spiritual priorities, your response to divine calling. The two nations struggling within her continue their conflict within you. Which will you feed? Which will you follow? Which will ultimately rule your heart and determine your destiny? The birthright that Esau traded carelessly remains available to those who recognize its value, who are willing to sacrifice temporal advantage for eternal significance, who understand that some inheritances are worth any price. The blessing that Jacob pursued through deception is now offered freely through grace to all who hunger and thirst after righteousness, who seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. The ancient foreshadowing becomes present invitation. Will you choose Jacob's path of spiritual pursuit despite personal cost? Or will you follow Esau's pattern of immediate gratification that forfeits eternal significance? In the end, their story becomes your story. Their choice becomes your choice. Their destiny becomes the mirror in which you see your own eternal future reflected. The silence that follows this ancient narrative should be filled with personal reflection, spiritual examination, and renewed commitment to pursue the inheritance that matters most. Jacob and Esau's conflict continues because it represents the eternal struggle between kingdoms of light and darkness, covenant blessing and natural rebellion, divine purpose and human resistance. The ancient foreshadowing validates itself through contemporary fulfillment, proving that divine patterns transcend time and culture, that spiritual principles govern human affairs despite surface appearances. The wrestling match at birth foreshadowed the wrestling match at Jabbok, which foreshadowed the wrestling match now taking place in your soul. Will you surrender to divine purpose and receive the blessing of transformation?